There was once a king chosen by God himself, a man anointed with sacred oil, a man who stood taller than everyone around him, a man the people admired, trusted, and celebrated. His name was Saul. At the beginning of his story, everything seemed perfect. He had the favor of heaven. He had the support of his nation. And he had a future that looked unstoppable. But years later, something terrifying happened. God spoke words that would echo through history. Not words of blessing, not words of encouragement, but words of regret. I regret that I have made Saul king. Imagine hearing those words spoken about you. Imagine rising to the highest position a person could hold, only to have the very God who placed you there declare that your rule was a mistake. How could that happen? How could a man chosen by God end up rejected by God? Saul's story is not just the story of a king who failed. It is the story of how power can slowly change a person, how fear can lead to compromise, how pride can grow quietly in the heart until it destroys everything. Because Saul did not fall in a single moment. He did not wake up one day and decide to turn away from God. Instead, his downfall happened little by little. One impatient decision, one moment of fear, one act of disobedience. Each step seemed small at first, almost harmless, but together they created a path that led straight toward disaster. At the height of his reign, Saul commanded armies. Thousands of soldiers obeyed his voice. When he entered a city, people stood in awe. When he spoke, leaders listened. Yet despite all his power, Saul carried a growing storm inside his heart. A storm of insecurity, a storm of jealousy, a storm that would eventually drive him to chase an innocent man across the wilderness for years. That man was a young shepherd named David, a man who would one day replace Saul. But before that happened, Saul would descend into a darkness few kings ever experienced. The Bible describes moments when his mind became troubled, moments when fear consumed him, moments when rage controlled him. The same king who once hid among the baggage because he felt unworthy to rule would later throw spears in violent anger. The same man who once walked in humility before God would eventually stop listening to God altogether. And when a leader stops listening to God, the consequences can be devastating. There came a time when Saul desperately needed guidance. Enemies surrounded his kingdom. His army trembled with fear, and Saul sought an answer from heaven. But heaven was silent. The God who once spoke to him no longer responded. No dreams, no prophets, no guidance, nothing. In desperation, Saul did something he once would have condemned. He turned to darkness for answers. On a cold night filled with dread, the king disguised himself and went searching for a forbidden voice. A voice that should never have been consulted. A voice from the shadows. It was the final sign of how far he had fallen. Not long after that night, Saul stood on a battlefield watching his world collapse. The enemy advanced. His army scattered. And the king who once stood head and shoulders above every man in Israel faced a terrible end. Saul lost his kingdom. He lost his peace. He lost the presence of God. And ultimately, he lost his life. But the most tragic part of Saul's story is this. It did not have to happen. Saul was given everything a leader could ask for. Strength, opportunity, the guidance of a prophet, and the blessing of God. Yet somehow, it still ended in tragedy. So what went wrong? How did the first king of Israel fall so far? What decisions led him from divine favor to divine rejection? And perhaps most importantly, what warning does Saul's story carry for every person who hears it today? Because Saul's life reveals a powerful truth. Success does not guarantee faithfulness. Power does not guarantee wisdom. And being chosen by God does not mean a person cannot still lose their way. Tonight, we will uncover the rise, the warning, and the heartbreaking fall of the man history remembers as the king God rejected. The story of Saul. Long before Saul became a king, Israel was a nation without a throne. For generations, the people of Israel had been led by judges, leaders raised up in times of crisis. These judges were not kings. They did not build royal dynasties or rule from golden palaces. Instead, they were temporary leaders who guided the people during war or chaos. But as time passed, the people began to look at the nations around them. Other countries had kings. They had armies marching under royal banners. They had rulers who commanded respect and fear. Israel began to desire the same thing. The elders of the nation eventually approached the prophet Samuel with a request that would change their history forever. We want a king. They did not just want leadership. They wanted someone who would rule like the kings of the surrounding nations. Someone who would stand at the front of their armies. Someone who would make them feel powerful. But this request deeply troubled Samuel. He understood something the people did not. Israel already had a king. Their king was God. When Samuel prayed about the situation, God revealed a painful truth. The people were not rejecting Samuel's leadership, they were rejecting God's rule over them. Still, God allowed their request. And he told Samuel to appoint a king. Not just any king. A king chosen by God himself. That man was Saul. At that time, Saul was not a famous warrior or political leader. He was simply the son of a man named Kish from the tribe of Benjamin. Yet there was something about Saul that immediately stood out. The Bible describes him as remarkably tall and impressive in appearance. In fact, Saul was said to stand a full head taller than anyone else in Israel. If you were looking for someone who looked like a king, Saul would have been the obvious choice. But Saul himself did not seem to view his life that way. One day, his father sent him on a simple task, to search for some lost donkeys. It was hardly the mission of a future king. Saul and a servant wandered through the hills and countryside looking for the animals. They searched town after town, but the donkeys were nowhere to be found. Eventually, Saul began to worry that his father would stop worrying about the donkeys and start worrying about them instead. So he decided it was time to return home. But the servant suggested something unexpected. In a nearby town lived a respected man of God, Samuel the prophet. Perhaps Samuel could reveal where the donkeys were. So Saul agreed. Neither of them realized that this small detour was about to change the course of Saul's life forever. Before Saul even arrived in the town, God had already spoken to Samuel. The Lord told him that a man from the tribe of Benjamin would arrive, and that man would become the future king of Israel. When Saul finally approached, Samuel immediately recognized that this was the man God had chosen. But Saul had no idea what was happening. To him, Samuel was simply a respected prophet. Samuel invited Saul to a special meal and seated him in the place of honor among the guests. This must have seemed strange. Saul was not a prince. He was not a general. He was just a young man searching for lost animals. Yet Samuel treated him as if he were someone important. Later that evening, Samuel revealed the truth. He told Saul that the donkeys had already been found. But that was not the real reason Saul had been brought there. Samuel then spoke words that must have stunned him. All the desire of Israel is turned toward you. Saul could hardly believe it. He responded with confusion and humility. Am I not a Benjamite, he asked, from the smallest tribe of Israel? And is not my family the least of all the families of the tribe of Benjamin? In other words, Saul was saying, why would anyone choose me? At that moment, Saul did not see himself as king material. He did not act proud. He did not demand power. He seemed genuinely overwhelmed by the idea that God might choose him. The next morning, Samuel performed a sacred act. He took a flask of oil and poured it over Saul's head. Then he kissed him and declared that God had anointed him as ruler over his people. This moment marked the beginning of Saul's kingship. But Samuel also gave Saul several signs that would confirm God's calling on his life. As Saul traveled home, each of those signs happened exactly as Samuel predicted. At one point, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and Saul even began to prophesy among a group of prophets. People who knew him were shocked. Is Saul also among the prophets? They asked. It was clear that something extraordinary had begun. Yet Saul did not immediately seize power. When the time came for Samuel to publicly present the new king to Israel, the tribes gathered together. Samuel announced that God had chosen a king. Then they began casting lots to identify the chosen man. The tribe of Benjamin was selected. Then Saul's family. Finally, Saul himself. But when they looked for him, he was nowhere to be found. The future king of Israel was missing. Eventually, someone asked the Lord where Saul had gone. The answer must have surprised everyone. Saul was hiding among the baggage. The man chosen to rule a nation was literally hiding behind the supplies. This moment reveals something fascinating about Saul's character at the beginning of his story. He was not chasing power. He was not desperate for attention. If anything, he seemed afraid of the responsibility being placed on his shoulders. When the people finally brought him out, they saw just how impressive he looked. Samuel stood before the crowd and declared, "Do you see the man the Lord has chosen? There is no one like him among all the people." The crowd erupted with excitement. Long live the king! Israel finally had its first king. But Saul's early reign did not begin with arrogance. In fact, His first major moment as king revealed courage and leadership. When a foreign enemy threatened one of Israel's cities, Saul rallied the nation. He called the people to battle, and they responded. The army marched together, united under their new king. The result was a powerful victory. The enemy was defeated, and Israel celebrated. Suddenly, the people who once doubted Saul now praised him. His leadership had saved them. His courage had united them. His victory had given Israel confidence. It seemed like the beginning of a glorious reign. The humble man who once searched for lost donkeys had become the king of Israel. And for a time, everything looked promising. Saul had the support of the people. He had the guidance of the prophet Samuel. And most importantly, he had the favor of God. But beneath the surface of this success, small cracks were beginning to form. They were not obvious yet. They were quiet, subtle, almost invisible. But those cracks would eventually grow. And when they did, they would bring down the entire kingdom. At the beginning of Saul's reign, everything seemed promising. Israel had a king. The people were united. And Saul had already proven that he could lead the nation in battle. Yet leadership brings pressure. The higher a person rises, the heavier the responsibility becomes. And for Saul, that pressure soon revealed something hidden deep within his heart. Not long after his early victories, Israel faced a powerful enemy, the Philistines. For generations, the Philistines had been one of Israel's greatest threats. They were organized, experienced in warfare, and far better equipped. Their weapons were superior. Their armies were massive. When the Philistines gathered for battle, the scale of their force terrified the Israelites. The Bible describes their army as having thousands of chariots and soldiers as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Compared to that overwhelming force, Israel's army looked fragile. Many of Saul's soldiers were afraid. Some hid in caves. Others fled across rivers. The nation that had recently celebrated victory was now trembling with fear. Saul knew this battle could determine the future of his kingdom. But before going into war, there was something he was supposed to do. The prophet Samuel had given him a clear instruction. Saul was to wait 7 days. Samuel would come and offer sacrifices to God, asking for divine guidance and blessing before the battle. In ancient Israel, this act was deeply significant. Sacrifice was not just a ritual, it was a moment of surrender. A moment when the leader acknowledged that victory did not come from strength alone. It came from God. So Saul waited. Day 1 passed. Then day 2. Then day 3. With each passing day, the tension in the camp grew heavier. The Philistine army remained nearby, preparing for war. Their presence loomed like a storm on the horizon. Meanwhile, Saul's soldiers grew increasingly nervous. Some began slipping away from the camp. Others whispered in fear. Every hour that passed made Saul feel more desperate. By the 6th day, the situation felt unbearable. His army was shrinking. The enemy was growing stronger. And Samuel still had not arrived. Finally, the 7th day came. Saul waited. Morning passed. Then midday. Still no sign of Samuel. At that moment, Saul faced a choice. He could continue waiting and trust that Samuel would come. Or he could take matters into his own hands. Fear pushed him toward the second option. Saul made a decision that would change everything. "Bring me the burnt offering," he said. Instead of waiting for Samuel, Saul performed the sacrifice himself. At first glance, this might not seem like a terrible act. After all, he was still offering the sacrifice to God. He was still seeking divine favor. But the problem was not the ritual itself. The problem was obedience. Saul had been given a direct instruction. Wait. And he did not. The moment Saul finished presenting the offering, something happened that must have sent a chill through his entire body. Samuel arrived. The prophet walked into the camp just as the sacrifice was completed. Saul went out to greet him, perhaps hoping everything would appear normal. But Samuel immediately sensed that something was wrong. "What have you done?" he asked. Saul quickly began explaining himself. He spoke about the fear spreading through the army. He spoke about the Philistine threat. He spoke about how Samuel had not arrived when expected. Then Saul said something revealing. "I forced myself, therefore, and offered the burnt offering." It sounded like an excuse wrapped in responsibility. But Samuel saw through it. The prophet's response was sharp and direct. "You have done foolishly." Those words must have struck Saul like a hammer. Samuel continued speaking with authority. "You have not kept the command of the Lord your God." Then came a devastating announcement. If you had obeyed, the Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. But now, Your kingdom will not endure. This was the first crack in Saul's reign. Up until that moment, Saul still had the possibility of establishing a lasting dynasty. His family line could have ruled Israel for generations. But because of this act of disobedience, that future was now gone. Samuel revealed something even more shocking. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart. In other words, God had already begun searching for Saul's replacement. Saul was still sitting on the throne. He was still wearing the crown. But the process of losing his kingdom had already begun. And all of it started with what seemed like a small moment of impatience. Saul had not rejected God openly. He had not turned to idols. He had simply refused to wait. But that refusal revealed a deeper problem. Saul trusted his own judgment more than God's command. Fear had convinced him that obedience could wait. That logic had convinced him that the ends justified the means. Yet God measures leadership differently. In the eyes of heaven, obedience matters more than appearances. A leader can look strong and still be spiritually weak. A king can command armies and still fail the most important test. Saul had just passed that test, but not in the way he expected. From that day forward, Saul's reign carried an invisible shadow. He would continue ruling. He would continue fighting battles. He would continue wearing the crown. But something essential had been lost: the full confidence of God. And without that foundation, Saul's future would become increasingly unstable. The seeds of his downfall had been planted. At first, they were small, almost unnoticeable. But in time, those seeds would grow into something far more destructive. Because Saul's first act of disobedience was not the last. In fact, the next mistake he would make would be even worse. It would not just reveal impatience. It would reveal pride. And that pride would lead to a moment when the prophet Samuel delivered words no king ever wants to hear. Words that would seal Saul's fate forever. By this point in Saul's reign, the warning had already been given. His first act of disobedience had planted a shadow over his future. The prophet Samuel had told him that his kingdom would not endure forever. Yet Saul was still king. He still sat on the throne. He still commanded Israel's armies. He still had an opportunity to prove his faithfulness. But sometimes the greatest tests do not come during our moments of weakness. They come when we believe we are strong. One day, Samuel arrived with a message from God. This was not a suggestion. It was not advice. It was a direct command. Samuel spoke with the authority of heaven. This is what the Lord Almighty says: I will punish the Amalekites for what they did to Israel when they opposed them on the way when they came up from Egypt. Generations earlier, the Amalekites had attacked Israel when the nation was vulnerable, weary, and traveling through the wilderness. Now God declared that the time for judgment had come. Saul was given a clear mission. Go, attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Nothing was to be spared. Not their possessions. Not their animals. Not their king. This was one of the most serious military commands Saul had ever received. And this time, there were no complicated instructions. The order was simple: complete obedience. At first, Saul seemed ready to carry out the command. He gathered a large army of Israelite soldiers. The troops marched toward the territory of the Amalekites. The battle began. Israel attacked with force, and victory quickly followed. The Amalekites were defeated. The enemy army collapsed. The battlefield belonged to Saul. It looked like a perfect success. But something happened in the aftermath of the victory. Something that revealed the true condition of Saul's heart. Among the defeated Amalekites was their king. His name was Agag. Instead of executing him as commanded, Saul spared his life. But that was not the only problem. Saul's soldiers also noticed the best livestock among the Amalekites: healthy sheep, strong cattle, animals that were far too valuable to destroy. So Saul and the army made a decision. They kept the best animals alive. Everything weak or worthless they destroyed. But everything valuable they saved. To Saul and his men, this probably seemed reasonable. Why waste good livestock? Why destroy something that could benefit Israel? Perhaps Saul even convinced himself that the animals could later be offered as sacrifices to God. After all, it sounded spiritual. But there was a problem. God had not asked Saul to improve the command. God had asked him to obey it. Meanwhile, far away from the battlefield, the Lord spoke again to Samuel. And this time, the message carried deep sorrow. I regret that I have made Saul king. Those words echo with grief. Saul had been chosen. He had been given authority. He had been guided by a prophet. Yet now God declared that Saul had turned away from following him. Samuel was deeply troubled. The Bible tells us that he cried out to the Lord all night. This was not just the fall of a king. It was the heartbreak of a prophet watching a leader destroy his own calling. The next morning, Samuel went to meet Saul. But before Samuel arrived, Saul had already done something revealing. He had built a monument to himself. Not to God, to himself. It was a small detail in the story, but it spoke volumes. Pride had begun to grow inside the king. Eventually Samuel reached Saul, and Saul greeted him with confidence. "May the Lord bless you," Saul said. "I have carried out the Lord's instructions." For a brief moment, the scene almost feels surreal. Saul believed he had obeyed. Or perhaps he had convinced himself that partial obedience was good enough. Samuel listened quietly. Then he asked a simple question. "If you have obeyed the Lord, what then is this bleating of sheep in my ears?" In the distance, the sounds of animals filled the air. The very animals that should not have existed anymore. Saul quickly shifted the blame. "The soldiers brought them," he explained. "They spared the best sheep and cattle to sacrifice to the Lord your God." Notice the subtle shift in language. Saul did not say, "The Lord my God." He said, "The Lord your God." Samuel had heard enough. He interrupted Saul and spoke with prophetic authority. "Stop." Then Samuel reminded Saul of something important. "Although you were once small in your own eyes, did you not become the head of the tribes of Israel?" In other words, Samuel was reminding Saul where he had come from. There was a time when Saul had been humble, a time when he did not chase power, a time when he depended on God. But now that humility had faded, Samuel continued, "The Lord sent you on a mission and said, 'Go and completely destroy those wicked people.' So why did you not obey the Lord?" Saul tried to defend himself again. "But I did obey," he insisted. "I brought back Agag their king, and I destroyed the Amalekites." To Saul, the mission had mostly been accomplished. But God does not measure obedience in percentages. Obedience is either complete or it is not. Then Samuel delivered one of the most famous statements in the entire Bible. "Does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as in obeying the voice of the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice." And then came the final verdict. "Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king." Those words sealed Saul's fate. The crown was still on his head. The throne still belonged to him. But in heaven's eyes, his reign was finished. For the first time, Saul seemed to understand the seriousness of what had happened. "I have sinned," he admitted. "I violated the Lord's command." But even in his confession, another problem appeared. Saul explained why he had done it. "I was afraid of the men, and so I gave in to them." Fear. Once again, fear had guided his decisions. Instead of leading his people with conviction, Saul had followed their desires. Samuel turned to leave. But Saul grabbed the edge of Samuel's robe. The fabric tore in his hand. Samuel turned back and used that moment as a powerful symbol. "The Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from you today," he said, "and he has given it to someone better than you." Those words pointed to a future Saul could not yet see. A future that included a young shepherd named David. Saul begged Samuel to return with him so he could save face before the people. Samuel eventually agreed. But the relationship between the prophet and the king was never the same again. Before leaving, Samuel completed the command Saul had refused to carry out. He brought Agag forward, and Samuel himself executed the Amalekite king. The task Saul had avoided, the prophet finished. After that day, the Bible tells us something deeply tragic. Samuel never saw Saul again. Yet he mourned for him. The king God had chosen had become the king God rejected. And Saul's story was about to take an even darker turn. Because soon another man would rise in Israel. A young man with a heart completely devoted to God. A man whose success would slowly drive Saul into jealousy, paranoia, and madness. That man's name was David. And his rise would push Saul closer to the edge of destruction. After the confrontation with Samuel, the future of Saul's kingdom had already been decided in heaven. But on earth, nothing had changed, at least not yet. Saul still wore the crown. He still commanded the army. To the people of Israel, he was still their king. Yet something inside Saul had begun to shift. The confidence he once carried slowly began to erode. Fear crept into his thoughts. Insecurity whispered in his mind. And soon, an unexpected figure would appear who would amplify those fears in ways Saul never imagined. His name was David. At the time, David was not a warrior. He was not a prince. He was simply a young shepherd from Bethlehem. While Saul sat in the palace surrounded by soldiers and advisors, David spent his days in quiet fields watching over sheep. But history has a way of introducing unexpected heroes at exactly the right moment. One day, the Philistines once again gathered for battle against Israel. Their army assembled across a valley, and among them stood a champion unlike any warrior Israel had ever faced. His name was Goliath. Goliath was enormous, towering over ordinary men. His armor gleamed with bronze, and his spear was described as being as thick as a weaver's beam. Every morning and evening, he stepped forward from the Philistine ranks and shouted a challenge. "Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects." For 40 days, the giant repeated his challenge. And for 40 days, no one accepted. Not the soldiers, not the commanders, not even King Saul himself. The army that once marched with confidence now stood paralyzed with fear. Then David arrived at the battlefield. He had only come to deliver food to his older brothers who were serving in the army. But when he heard Goliath's challenge, something stirred inside him. David could not understand why the soldiers of Israel were allowing this giant to mock their God. While everyone else saw an unbeatable enemy, David saw something different. He saw a man defying the living God. Word of David's bold questions eventually reached Saul. The young shepherd was brought before the king. When Saul saw him, he was skeptical. David looked far too young to face a seasoned warrior like Goliath. But David spoke with surprising confidence. He explained that while tending his father's sheep, he had fought off lions and bears. And he believed the same God who protected him then would deliver him now. Saul finally agreed to let him try. At first, Saul attempted to place his own armor on David. But the armor was too heavy, too unfamiliar. So David removed it. Instead, he took a sling and 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream. When Goliath saw David approaching, the giant laughed. "Am I a dog," he shouted, "that you come at me with sticks?" But David was not afraid. He answered with words that would echo through history. "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty." Then the battle began. David ran forward. He placed a stone in his sling and hurled it with precision. The stone struck Goliath directly in the forehead. The giant staggered. Then he fell face down on the ground. In a single moment, the terrifying champion of the Philistines was defeated. The battlefield erupted. The Philistine army fled. Israel charged forward in pursuit. And the young shepherd who no one expected to win became the hero of the nation. For Saul, the victory must have seemed like a blessing at first. After all, the enemy had been defeated. But something unexpected happened as the army returned home. As Saul and David entered the cities of Israel, women came out singing and dancing. They celebrated the victory with music and joy. But the lyrics of their song carried a message that struck Saul like a blade. Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands. To most listeners, this was simply praise for 2 heroes. But Saul did not hear it that way. He heard comparison. He heard a threat. The Bible tells us that Saul became very angry. The song displeased him greatly. "What more can he have but the kingdom?" Saul muttered. From that day forward, Saul looked at David with suspicion. At first, the jealousy remained hidden. But it did not stay that way for long. Soon Saul's inner turmoil began to surface in disturbing ways. The Bible describes how a troubling spirit began to torment the king. His moods became unstable. Darkness clouded his mind. During one of these troubled moments, David was brought to the palace to play music for Saul. His harp soothed the king's troubled spirit. For a time, the music calmed Saul's mind. But the jealousy remained. One day, while David was playing his harp, Saul suddenly gripped a spear. The weapon flashed through the air. Saul hurled it directly at David. "I will pin him to the wall," he thought. But David moved quickly and escaped. It was the first time Saul openly tried to kill him, and it would not be the last. Despite Saul's hostility, David continued to succeed in everything he did. Whenever Saul sent him into battle, David returned victorious. The soldiers admired him. The people loved him. Even Saul's own son, Jonathan, formed a deep friendship with David. Jonathan recognized something special in him. He saw courage, humility, and faith, qualities that once defined Saul himself. But the more David succeeded, the more Saul's jealousy burned. Saul began plotting ways to remove him. At first, the king tried to use warfare as a trap. He hoped David would be killed in battle. But every mission Saul assigned ended in success. The young warrior seemed protected by an invisible hand. Eventually, Saul stopped hiding his intentions. He openly ordered his servants to kill David. But Jonathan warned his friend and helped him escape. From that moment forward, David became a fugitive, and Saul became a hunter. The king who once led Israel against foreign enemies now spent years chasing a single man through deserts, caves, and wilderness. Again and again Saul tried to capture David. Again and again David escaped. On multiple occasions, David even had the chance to kill Saul. Once in a cave, once while Saul slept in his camp. But David refused. He would not harm the king God had originally anointed. Instead, he spared Saul's life. Each time this happened, Saul briefly realized the depth of David's integrity. He even admitted his wrongdoing. But the regret never lasted. The jealousy always returned. The king who once stood tall and confident now lived in constant suspicion and rage. The throne he fought so hard to protect was already slipping away. And the more Saul tried to control his fate, the faster everything seemed to unravel. The rise of David was not simply the story of a new hero. It was the mirror that revealed Saul's deepest fears. Every victory David achieved reminded Saul of what he was losing. Every cheer from the people felt like another step toward the end of his reign. And the darkness inside Saul's heart continued to grow. Soon, his desperation would drive him to make one final, tragic decision. A decision that would push him completely beyond the boundaries God had set. A decision that would take place on a dark night filled with fear. The night Saul sought answers from a forbidden voice. And that night would lead directly to the final chapter of his life. By the final years of Saul's reign, the once promising king had become a shadow of the man he used to be. The courage that once inspired Israel had faded. The humility that once defined him was gone. Instead, Saul lived with constant fear. Fear of losing his throne. Fear of the rising popularity of David. Fear of enemies gathering around Israel once again. And now, another storm was approaching. The Philistines had assembled a massive army. Their forces moved steadily toward Israel's territory, preparing for a decisive battle. When Saul saw the enemy camped across the valley, the Bible tells us something very revealing. His heart trembled with fear. This was not the fearless leader who once rallied Israel to victory. This was a king overwhelmed by dread. In his desperation, Saul did something he had done many times before. He sought guidance from God. He prayed. He waited for an answer. But this time, nothing came. No dreams. No prophets. No message from heaven. The God who once guided Saul's steps was silent. And that silence terrified him more than the enemy army. For a leader who once relied on divine direction, the absence of God's voice felt like standing alone in a dark wilderness. Saul did not know what to do. In the past, when Israel needed guidance, they would turn to the prophet Samuel. But Samuel was gone. The prophet who had anointed Saul, warned Saul, and confronted Saul had died. Without Samuel, Saul felt completely lost. Yet instead of turning back to repentance and humility, Saul made a decision that revealed how far he had fallen. Years earlier, Saul himself had removed mediums and spiritists from the land. He had declared that seeking guidance from such sources was forbidden. But now, in his fear, he began searching for one. Eventually his servants told him about a woman living in a place called Endor. She was known for practicing forbidden spiritual rituals. In other words, she was a medium, a woman believed to communicate with the dead. Saul knew the law of God clearly condemned such practices. But desperation can push people to cross lines they once promised never to cross. So Saul disguised himself. Under the cover of night, he traveled with 2 men to the woman's house. Imagine the scene. The king of Israel, moving through the darkness in secret. Not seeking a prophet. Not seeking God. But seeking a voice from the grave. When Saul arrived, he asked the woman to bring up the spirit of a man he named. That name was Samuel. At first, the woman hesitated. She reminded Saul that the king had outlawed such practices. She feared that this request might be a trap. But Saul swore an oath that no harm would come to her. So the woman began her ritual. And then something happened that terrified her. She suddenly cried out in shock. Because the figure she saw was not just any spirit. It was Samuel. And in that moment, the woman realized the truth. Her visitor was not an ordinary man. He was King Saul. When Saul asked what she saw, she described an old man wrapped in a robe. Saul immediately understood. It was Samuel, the prophet who had once guided him, now appearing from beyond death. Saul bowed low to the ground, and Samuel spoke. The words that followed were not comforting. They were terrifying. "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" Samuel asked. Saul explained his fear. The Philistines were preparing for battle. God no longer answered him. He did not know what to do. Samuel's reply was blunt. "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy?" Those words must have pierced Saul's heart. Samuel reminded him of the moment years earlier when he refused God's command regarding the Amalekites. That act of disobedience had set everything in motion. Then Samuel delivered a prophecy that sealed Saul's fate. "Tomorrow you and your sons will be with me." In other words, Saul would die in the coming battle, and Israel would lose the war. The king collapsed to the ground in terror. All strength left his body. He had eaten nothing that entire day, and now fear drained the last of his energy. The woman eventually persuaded Saul to eat something before leaving. But nothing could erase what he had just heard. The prophecy hung over him like a dark cloud. The next day, the Philistine army advanced. The battle began on the slopes of Mount Gilboa. Israel fought fiercely, but the Philistines were stronger. The army of Israel began to retreat. Saul's sons fought bravely alongside him. Among them was Jonathan, the loyal friend of David. During the battle, Jonathan was killed. The loss of his son must have shattered Saul's heart. Soon the Philistine archers found their target. Arrows struck Saul. He was badly wounded. The once mighty king now lay bleeding on the battlefield. Realizing the enemy was closing in, Saul feared being captured and humiliated. He turned to his armor-bearer. "Draw your sword and run me through," Saul commanded. But the young man refused. He could not bring himself to kill the king. So Saul made one final decision. He took his own sword, and he fell upon it. The first king of Israel died on that battlefield, not surrounded by victory, not celebrated by his people, but alone in defeat. When the armor-bearer saw what had happened, he did the same. By the end of that day, Saul and several of his sons were dead. The kingdom he once ruled had collapsed in a single battle. The man who once stood head and shoulders above all Israel had fallen to the ground, and the crown he fought so desperately to keep was about to pass to another. The story of Saul does not end on the battlefield. His body lay on the slopes of Mount Gilboa, but the lessons of his life would echo far beyond that tragic day. Once, Saul had been the hope of a nation. He was the first king Israel ever had, chosen by God, anointed by the prophet, admired by the people. At the beginning of his story, everything pointed toward greatness. He had the strength of a warrior. He had the support of the nation. He had the guidance of a faithful prophet in Samuel. Most importantly, he had the favor of God. Yet somehow, the man who started with so much promise ended in one of the most tragic downfalls in the entire Bible. The question is not simply what happened to Saul. The deeper question is why. Why did the first king of Israel fall so far? Because Saul's downfall was not caused by a single catastrophic mistake. It was caused by a series of small decisions that slowly reshaped his heart. The first mistake was impatience. When Saul faced the Philistine threat early in his reign, he refused to wait for Samuel and offered the sacrifice himself. It may have seemed like a small act, but it revealed something important. Saul trusted his own judgment more than God's command. Then came the second failure. When God commanded Saul to completely destroy the Amalekites, Saul partially obeyed. He won the battle, but he spared the king and kept the best livestock. To Saul, this probably seemed practical, but obedience to God is not measured by convenience. Samuel's words that day became one of the most powerful lessons in Scripture. To obey is better than sacrifice. Saul had convinced himself that a good intention could replace full obedience. But God does not accept partial loyalty. Then came the third stage of Saul's downfall: jealousy. When the young shepherd David defeated the giant Goliath, the entire nation celebrated. David became a hero overnight. Instead of seeing David as a blessing to Israel, Saul saw him as a threat. That jealousy slowly poisoned the king's mind. The man who once led Israel against its enemies began chasing his own servant through deserts and caves. Years passed in this pursuit, years that could have been spent strengthening the kingdom. But jealousy blinds even the strongest leaders. And finally, Saul reached the darkest moment of all. When the Philistine army gathered for the final battle, Saul sought guidance from God, but heaven was silent. Instead of turning back to humility and repentance, Saul crossed a forbidden line. He sought answers from a medium. In doing so, Saul stepped fully outside the boundaries God had set for his people. That night, the spirit of Samuel delivered the prophecy that sealed Saul's fate. The next day, Saul and his sons fell on the battlefield. His kingdom collapsed. His life ended, and the crown he tried so desperately to protect passed to another man. That man was David. Unlike Saul, David was not perfect. He made serious mistakes of his own. But there was one difference that changed everything. David never stopped turning back to God. Even when David failed, he repented. Even when David sinned, he humbled himself. Saul, on the other hand, slowly hardened his heart. Instead of repentance, he offered excuses. Instead of humility, he chose pride. And that difference shaped the destiny of both men. Saul's story stands as a powerful warning. It reminds us that success at the beginning of a journey does not guarantee faithfulness at the end. It reminds us that leadership requires more than strength and talent. It requires obedience. Saul had everything a king could want. Yet he lost it all because he stopped listening to the voice that had placed him on the throne. And perhaps the most sobering truth of Saul's story is this. His downfall did not begin with rebellion. It began with small compromises. Moments of fear. Moments of impatience. Moments when he trusted himself more than God. Those moments slowly reshaped his character until the man who once hid among the baggage became the king who chased shadows. The man who once walked in humility became the king consumed by pride. And the man who once heard God's voice clearly ended his life in silence. But Saul's story is not only about tragedy. It is also about warning. A warning that power can corrupt the heart. A warning that jealousy can destroy relationships. And a warning that partial obedience is still disobedience. For every leader, for every believer, for every person seeking success and influence, the life of Saul asks a simple but powerful question. What happens when someone chosen for greatness stops listening to the one who chose them? Saul's story answers that question with painful clarity. A crown can be lost, a kingdom can collapse, and a life full of promise can end in regret. But the same story also reveals another truth. God's plans never fail. Even when one king falls, another rises. Even when one leader turns away, God raises someone new. After Saul's fall, the throne of Israel would soon belong to David. And through David's lineage, history would eventually lead to the birth of a far greater king. But that is another story. And it all began with the rise and the fall of the king God rejected.